by regulation when the Congress in a Democratic supermajority could not pass those bills to send them to the President's desk. They were intent on doing it by executive order. The same thing that we see happening potentially with the card check, forced unionization bill, could not pass in the last Congress. We see attempts to move that by regulation. There are issues with unfunded mandates on our schools, and even seeing an extension of that inside the Department of Education that further hamstrings already strapped local school districts. That could not get through the United States Congress. We're seeing attempts to do that by regulation. And what the REINS Act would simply do is say, stop, Mr. President, stop, Cabinet Secretary. You have to have the advice and the consent of the representatives of the American people before you're going to move for something that's going to hit us that hard. We have 197 co-sponsors on the bill so far. It's held 2 hearings in the Judiciary Committee, was passed out of the Judiciary Committee 2 weeks ago, had a markup in the Rules Committee to go over some technical pieces inside of the bill with the timelines on vote triggers. It's passed out of the Rules Committee, and we're looking for a vote here, hopefully in the very near future, to see it passed and sent over to the United States Senate. But I appreciate what you are doing to champion this move to not only awaken the American people to the huge economic impact of overregulation, but presenting a wide variety of legislative fixes that you and many of our colleagues have authored to stem this tide of reach of the government and to allow our economy to stand up in energy, in manufacturing, and agriculture. And with that, I thank you and yield back.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Davis, for reclaiming my time, and I thank you for the work you've done on the REINS Act. It's good. This is a good bill. This needs to be passed by the Congress. I hope that our colleagues over on the Senate side, when they grab a hold of this, that they get excited about it and realize that regulations impose more burdens on the American people than this Congress does. And in many instances, they come to us and say, why did you pass this law to put this burden on us, when their real issue is they don't understand it was done by regulations by people who were not elected to do, like members here. You know, we have to answer to our boss, and our boss is the American people. And unfortunately, these regulations done by the executive branch agencies, I guess the only boss they have to answer to is the president. But they don't. In many instances, they're designed to be even independent of the president. And some of these regulations are not thought out in the real world, but they're in fact thought out in the minds of somebody that sits in a desk and just thinks this must got to be a good idea. And sometimes these good ideas overwhelm us in cost and quite frankly interfere with our lives. And so we've been talking about this. The American people are talking about it. When you go home, they want to know, what are you going to do about allowing the business people to have an idea of what the playing field is going to look like, because these regulations are changing the rules every time we look up. And I think that leads us into what I think is another excellent piece of legislation that I'm proud to be a part of. Excuse me. But my friend Mr. Ribble is the actual originator of this bill, and I jumped on it with him because it was a good idea. And so I'm going to yield to my friend and let him have a chance to explain this to us and what your idea was and why we both got into this mess of trying to make it clear for those who would make our economy grow just exactly what the playing field looks like.
Well, I want to thank my friend from Texas. Thank you so much for having me today. You know, I spent my entire adult life running my own business. And so this is something that I've had the opportunity, maybe the misfortune of having to deal with firsthand. And I found it interesting. Just a few weeks ago, on October 25th, Politico ran an article and said right here, regulations top issue for small businesses. And in fact, they cite a Gallup poll that indeed 41% of small business owners said that government was somehow related to the biggest problem facing their companies. More small business owners view the cost, I'm quoting here, more small business owners view the cost of complying with government regulations as a bigger problem than any other issue. And I've heard this time and time again. And just recently, I was up in northern Wisconsin, in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, where 3 other members of Congress and myself, we held a all-day session with the timber industry. We invited Chief Tidwell to come in from the U.S. Forest Service to talk about harvesting timber in our national forests. And I had a timber manager come up to me who harvests timber up in Wisconsin Northwoods, and she said to me, "Congressman, I want to show you something. If I do a timber sale here that's regulated by one of the counties here in northern Wisconsin, this is the contract that I have to fill out to harvest timber. That's the county contract." And then she said, "But you know what, Congressman, if the state of Wisconsin manages that timber sale, the contract gets about twice as long, and I have to manage that contract. But however, if the federal government manages the timber sale, this is the contract that we have to fill out for the federal government. Pages and pages and pages of bureaucratic red tape just to allow them to harvest timber that's owned by the taxpayer." And so I thought, you know what, after hearing a lot of these things and after having run my business, that maybe what this country needs more than anything, and I certainly support Congressman Davis's REINS Act. I think it's exactly the right thing to do. But I even want to take it a little step further. And you and I together put together a bill called the Regulatory Moratorium and Jobs Preservation Act. And this bill simply does one thing. It says that the government can't promulgate any new rules until unemployment goes below 7.8%. Because you and I know full well, in talking to all the businesses in our own districts, that unemployment and regulatory environment are connected. They're linked together. Now, I will have colleagues from the other side of the aisle say to me, "Well, Congressman, you know full well that this is all about demand, that demand is causing the problem, and without demand, people aren't going to hire." And I would say back that every single page of regulation, every single page of trying to comply, every single page has to be responded to by some business owner. And that means that response will have a direct cost to it. As you pile on cost after cost after cost, there have been 24,000 new rules promulgated on the American business owner since 2004, nearly 1 million pages of new regulations. Every single page, page under page after page, adds cost. And every single time the cost of any good or service goes up, there are fewer customers that can afford that product. And so demand must go down. So every time we add a new regulation, costs go up, demand goes down. Finally, we've come to a new end game here with over 9% unemployment. So we wanted to connect our bill to unemployment so that we can show the American people, prove to the American people the empirical evidence that if we would put a hold on new rules and regulations, if we would inject certainty in this regulatory environment where business owners knew what future costs were going to be, they can measure future costs because they know the government won't promulgate a new rule, they will begin to hire again. That new confidence will be there, new certainty will be there, and unemployment will go down. And then here's what I suspect will happen. As unemployment goes down, the American people will demand from Congress that we extend this rule until unemployment reaches 6%, or we get to full employment, as we find this out. Now, this rule does not remove a single safety net. This rule does not remove anything that's already there. I've heard people say, well, you're just trying to destroy the environment, as if I don't want to breathe clean air, as if I don't want to drink clean water, as if I want my grandchildren to swim in lakes and streams that are polluted. It's ridiculous on its face. I want to breathe clean air like every American. I want to drink clean water like every American. I want to eat safe food like every American. And this bill will do nothing to remove any of those protections whatsoever. What it will do, though, is stop the administration from, by executive fiat, creating rules and regulations that haven't been approved by this Congress. It'll stop. You know, I was listening as my colleague from Kentucky was speaking, and I was struck by something. I was struck by this. Article 1, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. It says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a House of Representatives and a Senate. Now, that word all, 3 simple letters, are pretty inclusive. All. It means all of them. And what the REINS Act does, it says that any rule that gets promulgated the Congress, the duly elected representatives of the citizens of the United States, get to say whether that makes a law or not. We get to say, because the Constitution gave us, the members in this body, the members in the U.S. Senate, the authority to execute legislative power, not some federal agency. And this REINS Act will reel it in. My bill and your bill, Representative Carter, will extend this control by the Congress, and it will simply return the power back to our legislative, duly elected members of Congress. And with that, I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, you just said a magic word that I want to repeat. Responsibility. Our founders designed our form of government so that we defined rights in our Bill of Rights, but it also points out where the responsibility lies. And I would argue that when these creations of regulatory acts, it allows people to avoid being responsible. They pass a law in Congress for the timber industry, and they give the authority to a branch of the executive to write rules to implement that legislation. And it allows this Congress to hide from those regulations. That's one of the reasons I've been talking up here for a year and a half now about regulations. It's time for we all know our rights, and it's time for those of us who have accepted a position of responsibility to be responsible. And when an unknown bureaucrat in a cubbyhole somewhere in the vast jungle of offices in this town can write a regulation that affects the very lives of American citizens, and he's going to get his paycheck. Nobody elected him. He's not going to get fired. You don't get run off for writing that regulation. He's been assigned to do rules and regulations. He doesn't take responsibility for it. He's hiding as a bureaucrat back there under civil service. And it's time for the Congress to step back up based on the articles of the Constitution that you just read and take our responsibility. And then those of us who answer to the people every 2 years and every 6 years, they're our bosses. They're the people that hired us for this job. And when they have one of these regulations, they have somebody they can go to and say, you need to be responsible for implementing the regulatory moratorium and stopping these regulations. They are killing us. Let me just give you some examples real quickly that we've gathered on just some stuff these are current events, okay? This is like looking back at current events for the last 6 or 8 months. EPA greenhouse gas regulations, potential job loss as a result of those regulations, 1,400,000 jobs. New utility regulations, 1,400,000 jobs. Offshore oil and gas lease delays, 504,000 jobs. Offshore drilling permitatorium. They say they're going to introduce permits, but then they just don't ever get right around to doing it. 430,000 jobs. Reclassification of coal ash as hazardous. This affects this area right here, 316,000 jobs. The new boiler regs that are coming out, 60,000 jobs. The Alaska drilling delays, 57,000 jobs. The new cement kiln regulations, 15,000 jobs. Just that little block adds up to 4,182,000 jobs that regulations are going to add to the unemployment rolls at a time when we have got unemployment at 9%. And that, by the way, I like the concept that you introduced and explained to me. Go back to what the unemployment was at the time that this administration came into being, 7.8%. I think that's more than reasonable.
Yeah, would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I couldn't agree more. Matter of fact, unemployment has never been lower since the day President Obama has been sworn into office. And I remember, I'm a freshman member here in Congress. I had the privilege, really, of sitting in this chamber for the President's State of the Union address. And the President said in that State of the Union address that he was going to ask for a regulatory review of the executive branch. He wanted to know what they were going to be doing, and he even made jokes about some of the ridiculous regulations. And what we've done now, we've got one more president that has followed the traditions of dozens of presidents who have ordered another study. And in the meantime, the American people suffer while we study something that we already know. This is not so much about whether the government can create jobs. It's about whether the government is obstructing job creation, which is exactly what's happening. And that's why we decided to pick that number. And I yield back.
And I think that's creative thinking. That's basically saying, and we need to get unemployment below 7.8. But it's a good point to start. And it gives us an opportunity to target what I honestly believe, and a lot of economists agree with, that the real solution to this situation we're in with our country right now is to get Americans back to work. The President believes one more stimulus, the last one didn't work, the spending, the massive spending, the trillions of dollars of additional debt we've accumulated in the last 3 years didn't quite work. It wasn't quite big enough. We need to do it just one more time, and this time it'll push it over the top. Well, I just don't think that the American people, they're not buying that. They're watching the current events of today, where we loan money to companies that didn't have a concept that was going to pay for itself, and they're going broke. Where we threw money at a problem instead of putting some common sense into the problem. Let a businessman, you nailed it, and you were one, and for a while in my life, I was a small businessman. You got to know what's around the corner. You can't hire somebody if there's unknown around the corner, because when you hire them, you get around the corner, you might have to fire them, because that unknown is going to make it to where it's not profitable for you to have this person who you hope will make your business more profitable. They would make it less profitable. People don't seem to understand around here. They think people hire people because somebody gives them a tax incentive, or there's some incentive that somebody gives them some little extra money this month. No, you hire someone to make your business more profitable. It's about prospering in your business. If you don't need somebody to prosper your business, you're not going to hire them. And all the incentives in the world are going to make you hire somebody that doesn't make your business work. Whether you're a little bitty business or whether you're the biggest business in the world, that's the way it works. And so the reality is, as they plan, and you know, there was a time, I read an article on this, there was a time where business planning was relatively short term. And in fact, one of the things that came out of the Great Depression was the concept of long-term planning, both short-term, mid-term, and long-term planning for a businessman, because you needed to know not only what was around the next 2 years or the next 5 years, but you need to know at least around the next 10 years. That's why one of the things when we've got these tax bills we have passed that will just end on a certain date. Well, if you know it's going to end, you got to plan around it. You plan to avoid it. But when that drop dead date comes up, like we've got on the Bush tax cuts, they call them around here, businessmen are looking at those things and say, what is that going to mean to my bottom line? I don't know, so I'm not hiring anybody. I'm not expanding my business. I'm not building a building, because I don't know what that means. The regulations, unknown regulations in the minds of regulators could change my world, could absolutely shake my world. So this is and right at this time, in this economy, when the number one thing you hear from every businessman you talk to is the unknown, whether it be the new financial regulations which have made financing unknown, whether it be the hidden tax increases in the health care bill, or whether it be regulations that we don't understand and we were surprised to get, we don't know what's going to happen, so we're not doing anything. We're sitting with our hands in our pocket, hopefully a little money in those pockets while we sit there, and we're not doing anything until we know what's going on. That's why this moratorium is perfect. It's perfect. We yield back to my friend.
You know, I think there's something salient here that we really need to hit on. You and I believe, as do many of our colleagues, and more importantly, small business owners and large business owners alike, believe that this type of bill will actually increase employment. And the very interesting point about this is it doesn't cost the taxpayer a penny. What this will cause is that businesses who have now been putting their money in the bank and have been holding it because of fear, we will unleash that money back into the sector, back into the private sector, to create jobs and get this economy going, and not a single penny of taxpayer dollars will be expended as a result of this. This is a simple thing. And you know, since the President talked to us back in January, over 70,000 pages been added to the Federal Register. 70,000 pages. 539 rules have been deemed significant under the Executive Order 12.866. Stop and think about these numbers. 116.3 million hours of annual paperwork burden being added. And all of this continues to create that uncertainty. Why would you as a business owner spend any money when you have no clue what that future cost will be? And just recently I was talking to some friends of mine in my district at Tillmany Pulp and Paper Company in Kaukauna, Wisconsin, hometown where my roofing company is. And they were sharing with me their concerns about the EPA clean air ruling in a new rule called Boiler Mat. And they said if that rule was promulgated, Wisconsin's paper industry would be decimated. But what's really most troubling is the fact that this is a revision of a rule that they just put in place a few years ago. So the entire paper industry in Wisconsin had to upgrade their boilers, spend millions of dollars of investment, and then a few years later the EPA comes back and said, oops, we made a mistake, we really need to move the bar up again. And rightfully so, these business owners are calling their congressman, this time it's me, I'm sure you've heard from them in your own district, asking, well, if we spend another $50 million or $60 million, what assurance do we have that the EPA won't move the bar next year? And then we have to spend it again and again and again. At what point is clean air clean air? And that's the problem. And I'll tell you, it'd be very simple. When you start talking in the millions and millions of dollars, it is very simple to lose thousands and thousands of jobs. And this is exactly where our national economy is at right now. There has been an onslaught of regulations dumped on the American entrepreneur. Let's talk a little bit about access to credit. You know, I've been very critical about the Dodd-Frank bill. I understand the intent was to get at Wall Street, and I appreciate the intent of getting at the things that caused our economic crisis back in 2008. But what actually happened is it got at Main Street. So small business banks in my hometown of Appleton, they are now spending money and investing money hiring regulatory analysts when they ought to be hiring commercial lenders. You know, most jobs created in this country are created by small businesses. But in reality, it's really small businesses under 5 years old, businesses that need access to credit. I often wonder, would somebody like Steve Jobs be able to emerge in this type of environment today, building computers in his garage? I'm sure there's some rule against that now, and you can't imagine. I chuckled the other day when I saw a famous television host on MSNBC standing with her hard hat by the Hoover Dam, saying, we need big projects like this. We need big thinking like this. You know, Franklin Roosevelt ushered in these great programs to create jobs and generate energy. This was the boom day of the American mind. And I had to chuckle, thinking there'd be no way with the current EPA that you could ever build the Hoover Dam today. It just wouldn't happen. The environmental rules alone wouldn't allow for it. And I yield back.
Absolutely, you'd be dealing with the EPA. You'd be dealing with fish. You'd be dealing with the situation on endangered species, and that's clear down to the microscopic animals that you can't even see. All that. There's no way the Hoover Dam would get built like that. You know, there was a thing on History 2. I guess it was night before last that I watched about building of the Alaskan Highway, and we had gone to war with Japan, and everybody looked at the United States and said, my gosh, the Aleutian Islands, a part of the Alaskan, that time Alaskan territory, they're right close to the Japanese, and they're probably going to invade those islands. And how are we going to get materials, supplies, and men up to Alaska? There was no road between the United States and Alaska. Nobody checked a single regulatory act. Nobody did anything but say, get every bulldozer we got and head for the border. We're cutting the road straight up through Canada. We'll design it on the way up there. We'll direction it on the way up there. And they took off and they built a road. It was a gravel road, but it was the first road that connected the lower 48 to Alaska. And I looked at that thing and I said, my gosh, they wouldn't have gotten a mile and a half before they'd have been enjoined by every kind of group on God's green earth in this country under the present regulations we have in place, not even expanded regulations, which are getting worse, the present regulations. So when the president made that famous statement now that I enjoyed very much, he laughed and said, I found out that shovel-ready today is not really shovel-ready. And it's exactly the same regulations we're talking about here that keeps it from being shovel-ready. We're building about a 21-mile stretch of highway in my home county, trying to build one. We've been at it for 8 years. The money's in place. Section 1's got bulldozers sitting on the ground because Section 1's been approved, and we're still trying to get 21 miles of road built through regulations. I will say now, after a little work on our part, some regulators are being pretty reasonable, and we want to thank them for it. But the days of the Hoover Dam and the Alaskan Highway will never come back, not with the regulatory environment we have here. What we're trying to do is not let this thing expand any farther. We're not trying to kill species. We're not trying to mess up the air, like you said, or the water. We're trying to say we've got a good situation in place. And by the way, Mr. President, if it's a national security issue or a national emergency, submit it to us. Tell us what the emergency is. Let's visit with it. And if that's the case, this Congress will be reasonable. I think that's very. If we need review of the courts, and the individuals need review of the courts, we provide that in here. It's very respectful of other people's considerations on these rights. That's another, for a small bill, there's a lot of good thinking in this bill. And those are the things I want. Let me just read you something. This came out in the Columbus Dispatch. Okay, this is a quote from the president's regulatory push has usurped, paralyzed, and blocked the private sector decision making necessary for job creation. Decision making it is dash. Obama's massive intrusion into the heart of the nation's economy have not helped. Buying auto manufacturers and running roughshod over bankruptcy laws and investors' rights in the process, taking over a sixth of the economy devoted to health care, imposing new regulatory regime on the financial sector, and spending hundreds of billions of borrowed dollars with no great benefit. Add to this the recent actions of the Democrat-controlled National Labor Relations Board. Perhaps its most damaging move has been to bring legal action against aircraft manufacturer Boeing Company for building a manufacturing plant in South Carolina. The NLRB seeks to punish a company for creating new jobs at a time when unemployment is more than 9% and the nation's economic growth barely registers. The chilling effect on other companies that are consuming the ideas of building plants is incalculable. These moves have cowed, usurped, paralyzed, and blocked the private sector decision making that is necessary to get this nation moving again. That's a quote from the Columbus Dispatch, 9/5/11 this year. And that's a perfect statement of a big picture of the regulatory burden that's made the papers. But you can have just as much trouble with one bug. So we've got to, as we deal with this, we've got to have something that says King's X until we get this economy back rolling. And I will once again yield to my friend, and you tell me if you got other things you want to talk about.
Yeah, thank you for yielding back. I just thought it'd be interesting. The president was in here just a few weeks ago with his jobs bill, and I was struck. I actually came into the chamber, and with the intent of not really being critical, but to try to find out what is it that we could agree on so we could maybe, for the good of the American people, move those things forward. But I'll tell you, I was struck that the President didn't mention energy a single time. Now, we've lost millions of jobs in the energy sector. Just recently, the President decided to punt on Keystone, the Trans-Canada pipeline, which would have created thousands of jobs, by even the lowest estimate, thousands of high-paying union jobs. Fully, labor was supportive of it and decided to kind of punt on that and not let jobs. It seems like the President's jobs plan is really at the regulatory agencies, where since he's been sworn into office, employment has increased 13%. While the private sector is shedding millions of jobs, the President has decided to hire thousands of people at federal regulatory agencies. And I guess it's maybe so that they can implement the 3,573 new rules that have been put in place since January 2010. You know, we have to get to a place where we understand the connection between employment, the connection between costs and jobs, and just American competitiveness. How in the world can we have businesses compete in this day and age when there's a constant onslaught from the federal government? I just thought I might read a quote from CNBC. We asked several CEOs leading up to the speech, the President's speech, what bold steps President Obama could take to reduce the 9.1% unemployment rate. John Schiller, Chairman and CEO of Energy 21, said, if the government would get out of the way from a regulation standpoint and let us 21 do what we do good, you'll see us continue to hire and grow this economy. I think that's a message from across the board, said Schiller. And I believe it is a message. I for some reason, it just doesn't seem like the executive branch fully understands how this economy actually works. Obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, layer upon layer of new rules and regulations, and each one of them hurting job growth and employment in this country. David Park, President and CEO of Austin Capital. Regulations have companies running scared. They're coming at businesses, and some new regulations are already taking a toll, while others will soon. This could be a real deterrent to future entrepreneurs. And since most jobs are created by entrepreneurial companies under 5 years old, the difficulty of actually even forming and starting a company today is burdensome. It's hugely complex, all because of this endless stream of control and regulations, as if Washington, D.C., as if you and I, Judge, have all the answers. We don't have the answers. The answers are found in the private sector. The answers are found in the citizens of this great country. Recently, we passed a bill just the other day on ballast water. And I sit on the Transportation Committee, and I noticed while reading the bill that the federal government was going to promulgate rules for ballast water for ships that come into the United States and traverse throughout the Great Lakes. Now, my home is in Appleton, Wisconsin, just near Lake Michigan, just south of Green Bay, Wisconsin. We have the Port of Green Bay there. And the concern was, as I was reading the bill, that the federal government exempted themselves, that they were creating a whole new level of bureaucracy, red tape, and rules that they were going to promulgate on private shipping companies, but not on themselves. So a federal science ship or EPA vessel could traverse the whole globe and not have to manage ballast water the same way that everybody else did. So I added an amendment, and this body passed it, that said that if the federal government's going to promulgate rules on private shipping companies, they have to live by those same rules themselves. And it's high time that the federal government begins to treat the government the same way they treat the private sector. And I think if we start doing that type of thing, some of these problems will begin to go away, and I yield back.
That's good common sense. Thank you for doing that. We appreciate it. Congressman Ribble, I understand you have some support for this bill in the Senate. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there's a companion bill that is going through the Senate right now. It's the identical piece of legislation. It was crafted by Senator Ron Johnson, a colleague of mine from the great state of We thought, it'd be good for us to do a project together, and we talk quite often. And the idea of the attaching the moratorium to unemployment was Senator Johnson's idea. I thought it was a terrific idea, and he now has a companion piece of legislation. He told me that there's more than 20 co-sponsors in the U.S. Senate. This bill now has over 70 co-sponsors here in the House of Representatives, and it continues to move forward. I'm very optimistic that we're going to be able to pass this bill through this chamber and send it on over to the United States Senate, where I hope reason will rule the day, that they will see this doesn't remove a single safety, doesn't restrict any safety or put something out of the way that's currently in place. It just said, let's give the American entrepreneur, the American job creator, some breathing space. Let's give them some room to just have some certainty for the time being until unemployment starts to get going and the engine of our economy starts moving again. And I hope that, and I challenge the United States Senate, that after we send this piece of legislation over to them, that with most haste that they go ahead and pass it. And if they can't pass it, let's for sure let the U.S. Senate have a chance and the members of that chamber to vote on it. You know, they kind of have a method over there where they can protect members from having to make tough decisions. You know, they just table a piece of legislation, don't even vote on it. And I would challenge the Senate Majority Leader that when we send H.R. 2989 over there, that they would actually bring it to a vote, and let's have our U.S. Senate stand up and say whether they agree with this or not, and have them go officially on the record about whether they believe that regulations are a problem in this economy or not. And I yield back.
And when the American people hear that once again we've got over 20 bills that could have done something to turn this economy around that have been tabled, I hope they will ask themselves, why did the Senate table my job? Okay? Because everything's about jobs. When you table a piece of legislation, you're tabling somebody's job. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand, and that's just because they don't think about it. Once they start thinking about it, they can understand it. That they hear something like the pipeline. I happen to spend every summer of my life, from the time I was 15 until I graduated from law school, working on pipelines. I have worked in pipelines in Texas, Louisiana, and overseas in the Netherlands, in Europe, and in Belgium. So I'm an old laborer on the pipeline. When you hear pipeline, you think the pipeline of the pipeline, but you don't. The number of people involved in laying a pipeline and the number of assorted jobs you don't even think about that are involved in that are overwhelming. In many instances, you've got to cut roads out to where the pipeline's going to be there. So you've got road builders involved. You've got gravel haulers. In some instances, asphalt layers, if the farmer will let you. You've got the pipe. The pipe industry is making pipe. The welders are welding the joints. The people that are surveying the project. The heavy machinery is digging the ditch. Many individuals are cleaning the ditch with hand shovels because it's got to be a certain way, or you get a process which can cause the pipe to have an electrical charge on it. Their engineers are engineering it. Scientists are studying it. People who are the product that's going to flow down that pipeline is being tested, so that you see what stress levels you're going to have. It creates jobs, not just a pipe, but there's hundreds and hundreds of industries that are tied to just laying a pipeline. If you're drilling an oil well, the same thing. People, with those offshore drilling rigs, you know who got hurt bad on that? The guys that feed those people out there on those rigs. And the helicopter pilots that fly the food out there. I mean, these people, it shut down restaurants and closed down helicopter businesses in the Gulf Coast when we stopped moratorium on that. We forget those little guys that are providing those services to the big Exxon Mobil or something platform out there. But in reality, there's thousands of small businessmen connected to any major project like this. A minimum number of jobs for that construction on that pipeline that's been estimated is 25,000 jobs. I can tell you, unless the world has changed a whole lot since I was, the best paying job for a laborer that I could find in the state of Texas for a kid my age. And I worked until I was 26 years old on those things in the summertime. And it still was the best paying job for a part-time job I could find anywhere in the state of Texas, or even better in Europe. So the point being that there is a domino effect when there is a big project like this, or the lumber industry you were describing in your state, or the shipping industry on the Great Lakes. It's not just ships that are involved in the shipping industry. It's hundreds of other professions are involved in the shipping industry. And when we start thinking that concept, then we see when you go out and hit the big guy, people around this country have got this idea that big people are bad, big things are bad. And they don't realize that it takes hundreds and sometimes thousands of little guys to keep the big guys' project going. And they're all making a living, and they're all raising their families and having their homes based upon that project. This is the concept of what capitalism does and free enterprise does for our country. And when the regulators stop something like that pipeline, or when they put a moratorium on it till after the election, so you don't have to talk about it during the election time, that hurts little guys as well as big guys. And it's a wrong concept. We've got to make this country once again prosper. And it takes a lot of things to make it prosper. So we're just asking for the government not to be one of the hindrances. And I think that's what makes this a great bill. I want to thank you for joining me. We're just about out of time, and I want to thank you for joining me and explaining the bill and allowing me to be an original co-sponsor with you on this bill so we can work this together. I will do everything within my power to assist you in getting this bill to this floor and pass through this House, and hopefully Senator Johnson will get it done over in the Senate, and we'll help him where we can. And it'll be good for America to say time out on these regulations. Unless you have something further to say, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back the balance of our time.